Okay, go.
Welcome to 6 Train Therapy. I'm DJ MayDay, and with me,
all right,
I'm doing the intro.
Then do it.
Hello, welcome to 6 Train Therapy. I'm DJ MayDay, and once again, I got the Benito, el jefe más guapo, aquí, to tell us about tariffs.
Actually, I would prefer to be called Bennett Frochet and have a French little
Bennett
bit
Frochet, isn't that a chocolate?
No, no, Bennett Frochet.
Like no specifics?
You can say anything with tariffs. You can ask me anything.
Okay, cool. Well, I want your opinion, but I'm going to drop some whatever, little bit of knowledge I did research on, and then, move forward.
Fine.
Because it's crazy, because Alexander Hamilton was the first to...
They implemented it. That's what they did that, and that's why there were no taxes, because it was like taxation without representation. So they started doing the taxes, and that was paying for stuff.
After the Revolutionary War, trying to rebuild the infrastructure, that was the first thing that they did, was to tariff, to keep, to try to bolster manufacturing in the States. So that was the first. That was not the first thing. 2 years after.
Well, it was. I think when you look at the time, it was a very fertile environment.
Right.
You had this. It was. It was, for lack of a better word, an industrial revolution of sorts, because they realized that they could manufacture here, and they were self-sustained, and they,
Right, and just to kind of beat back competition and because before that,
it was wide open.
Yeah.
It was wide open. The ability to be able to, the turnaround time, the resources, all of it. I mean, there were a lot of natural resources here for them to tap into. And quite honestly, there weren't a lot of controls and oversight. And it was the wild, wild west. Literally. But
it was also too, like, they came from being a colony, and they weren't allowed actually to build manufacturing, because the UK wanted you to buy everything from them. They wanted to control everything.
Correct. So
that was interesting. The Revolutionary War spurred on the first wave of American tariffs in existence. And then there was another big one, and the tariffs seemed to coincide with like landmarks. That's the thing I noticed. Like, so during the Civil War, there was one called the Abomination, the Tariff of Abomination, which was, again, high tariffs on imports, which kind of like influenced the South, because they were doing agriculture, so they were pushing out a lot of agriculture, cotton, sugar, all that stuff, and they were being tariffed. And in the North, they were kind of leaning towards manufacturing, so they were benefiting with the tariffs because they didn't have competition. Right. So I did a little research. Not that I knew this stuff, so I had to write this out, print it out.
I don't know the long history. I know I'm more relevant now. How it impacts us.
That's where it's gonna full circle come right to you.
Okay.
But so after the wave of Civil War era tariffs, there were another set of tariffs in the 1890s. They were called the tariffs of the protectionism. So they were just right at, like you just mentioned, the Industrial Revolution. Again, to protect American businesses, manufacturing, all that stuff. So that again kind of makes sense. Kind of is like, all right, there's a methodology. It seems like after every big American event, whether it be war or Industrial Revolution, Civil War, there's some kind of strategy with tariffs that kind of hit.
Yep.
And also, again, I'm just going to run through them real quick, and then we'll lead up to where you come in. The Great Depression. So again, it was a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the Great Depression, the collapse of the banks, and then it was a global kind of a recession that followed. So the immediate American reaction was to implement tariffs. And these were kind of hurtful from the things that I'm reading. Eventually they were hurtful.
Well, I think their goal was because there were so many people out of work that they wanted to increase the GDP, right?
Right.
And put everybody back to work here, and they wanted to protect that. That was really needed.
Yeah, yeah, and there was what was that thing? There was a big, not the Marshall Plan. It was some plan. I'll pop it up when I figure out what it is. But it was a plan to get everybody working again, like you just said.
Yeah.
And then again, another big event, World War II, right? So this is like the event, I guess, for us, that leads to us. And this also impacted tariffs and global commerce, and in a different way this time. Now, the United States being, I get, lack of a better word, being on top, and actually trying to restabilize their allies, and Japan, the liberalization of GATT. So it's an abbreviation for something I can't remember. Again, I'll pop it up, GATT. But it was a movement to take away tariffs, kind of liberate countries and kind of stimulate their economies.
Well, it was about globalization.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess the United States kind of headed that, and it also led to NATO as well. So there was a lot of things that were happening. Again, a huge, monumental kind of event. Mm-hmm. And then this is the final one that leads to us. Like modern trade agreements, like NAFTA.
NAFTA.
And then the other one,
Mexico and Canada.
Right. So these were interesting because they were really liberalizing trade. They were really opening up trade, and this was not that long ago, 20, 30 years ago. So it was like almost the reverse of what tariffs is, and we were in that rhythm of that. And also with China, we were in deep commerce and exchange, and everything seemed kind of okay. The first round of big tariffs since, I guess,
was it 2020? I thought it was. Oh yeah, I guess during in the middle of his first term.
Right.
I don't remember the year, but that's when he implemented. But that wasn't global. That was only for China specifically, and it was 7.5%.
Right, but it was a shift in our policy. Like it was a big shift in the policy that I grew up with, which was like the free trade agreement. You always heard about that, especially in the 90s and until the early 2000s. You always heard free trade agreement, and I never fully understood. I kind of took it verbatim what it stands for. You know what I mean? And it made sense. We should trade freely with our allies.
Well, but I think if you look at everything, and I don't think that the general populace knows that we do on importing already prior to the tariffs pay what we call duty.
Right.
And that's a rate that is based upon a product category, and depending upon our ability to manufacture it will determine the amount of percentage. So for instance, cotton, if it comes in, I think it's around 16% that you have to add on to in textile. For anything that is what they call a blend that is poly or man-made rich, and
right.
The cotton is the minority
ingredient.
Yeah, we can say that. Ingredient to the garment, you pay a higher duty because it's petroleum based and it's based, so that's around 29 to 32%. So there are duties in place. The tariffs that are coming now are on top of that, right?
Let me ask you this, just so I understand, like, I hear the word duty, and I'm thinking, is it kind of like when you get on an airplane, you buy a pack of cigarettes, a box of cigarettes or whatever, or liquor, and then...
When they say duty free,
right.
When they say duty free, you don't have to pay that tax when you come into the country. So if you come into the U.S. and you're in Europe or somewhere, it's what they call duty free, the duty free shops.
Is that the same thing, the percentage, or is it just the taxes?
That's
and the
different. That's at retail. I think the manufacturing, it's the same concept, but that's more to promote, I guess,
the local liquor,
the local and the travel and commerce and things like. But on the larger scale, if you take the textile industry, the importing of apparel into the country, that's why they had the duty. They set up the duty rates on everything, which is fine, right? So they've had these duty rates for over 25 years, right? And maybe even longer. I'm not quite sure when it was implemented. So you have these duty rates that you have to pay, and the retailers and the manufacturers base their prices on those current duties, right? So whether it's Walmart or whether it's Costco or if it's Ross Stores or Macy's, any of the major retailers were able to base their retail prices, or the manufacturers importing it, base their prices to sell based upon those duty rates. So the retailer knew that's what it's going to be.
Okay.
Now, this year, we already had the 7.5% imposed for anything coming in from China on top of the duties. So if you had that 16% for cotton, it was another 7.5%. So it was about 23% that you were paying. So now, what happens? The cost of goods increases. The importer has to charge higher prices, and when he charges higher prices, the retailer, if he's buying it and wants to maintain the same selling price, has a reduction in their margins and in their profit. That 7.5% wasn't as devastating. People found ways to absorb it. They split 3% here, 3% there, and they figured it out. But with the implementation of the 10% and what was going to be the reciprocal tariffs, somewhere in some places, for instance, out of Vietnam, was 46%.
Wow.
So that happened in March of this year, in 2025. For the importers and manufacturers of the product, we had already have stuff in production. Contracts have been signed with the retailers and POs have been cut, and we established a set price. Now, the government originally said, okay, we're going to do this 46%, and then rescinded it and said, you know what, let's just go with the 10%. But even that 10%, right, if you have to add that to your cost and you have to pass it on to the retailer's profit drops, right? Right? Because they don't want to change their retail price point. They have a business model that caters to a certain demographic or psychographic in the market, and if they have to increase their prices, the velocity of sales will drop, right? So they want to maintain those prices. But what happens is they will lose money. So now we're stuck with a 10% tariff. And we've already established these prices. So as manufacturers, importers, and vendors, we had to go back to the retail customer and say, here's this 10%. How are we going to balance this? So in most instances, depending upon the margin level, and specifically for the company that we work for, because we work on very thin margins, we had to pass a little bit of it on to the retailer, right? Which caused some significant problems. When you have when you have an increase in cost, and you have to maintain your retail price point, your margins drop. So there's only two things that they can do. Is A, increase the prices for the consumer, or B, cut their overhead, right, to adjust to compensate for the additional costs. So what you're seeing is people like Walmart had stated, we're going to have to raise our prices. There are other retailers out there who have said, well, this 10% tariff is going to cost us $300 million. We're going to reduce our overhead by $200 million, and they're going to let people go. Make no mistake about it that the 10%, if the retailer was to add it to their costs, the consumer pays for it.
But isn't that the ultimate outcome anyway, regardless of whether it's going to eventually, if it holds, it's going to eventually.
Well, what ends up happening is strategically, if they wanted an implementation, if the government wanted an implementation of these tariffs, strategically, what they could have done was set the table for 2026, not 2025. Major disruption. major disruption, and maybe that was.
Is that because you have like stuff shipping, stuff
Yeah,
import?
nobody had any incredibly vulnerable, so you have no option. If it was something that came down in 2025 and said, in 2026, anything that comes in will be this, retailers, vendors alike could strategically get together and determine how they're going to address this. Do they are they able to negotiate with the manufacturers maybe a little bit differently to help offset the 10%? Or is there a different level of quality that they can bring the price down? There are other ways to offset it, but the way this happened now has created significant turmoil. And with the exception of China, everybody's at 10%, but China, I don't know where it currently sits, but it could be at 50% on the tariff, or it could be 150%. It's a lot to absorb. And I don't know what the end game is. Right. I don't know if it's a negotiating tactic, but either way, the consumer is the one that's going to pay the price.
Yeah. Like, before you said that when you kind of led us to the present day, the one thing I noticed when I was doing the research, it was like huge events happened and they kind of spurred these responses, sort of. You know what I mean? It wasn't like tariffs were just any president or any leader was just whipping out tariffs. It usually something triggered it, something kind of.
Well, I think that
my question is, what triggered this
I
event?
think that the current administration, has been touting about, again, let's make America great again, right? So if you want to make America great again, and you are presented with what you feel is unfair balance from these other countries, right? You need to treat us with respect. You need this. That probably was the motivation, because it's all part and parcel of the big mission, right? To make America great again. I think, or I don't think, I know that, yes, we should have fiscal responsibility, accountability, and there should be a balance between all the countries. But a more measured, strategic approach than coming in and slashing and burning and going on to a stage with a chainsaw really isn't the proper approach.
On that note, like, I don't know if you remember this era during the 80s where Japan was really kind of dominating the manufacturing market, and whether it be cars, electronics, all kinds of things. And there was kind of the way we worked with them kind of eased that, what may have seemed like we were losing jobs. Like, for instance, Japan opened up a lot of manufacturing plants in the United States. Still owned them, and Americans worked those plants. There were deals made, like, to offset the disparity.
Well, what happened was, but they offered something. They brought technology. Right. They brought the technology and the efficiencies to be able to manufacture maybe better than we were able to do. So it's not as though they didn't bring anything here. So they provided jobs to American workers. Right.
But there was a kind of a fair-ish exchange.
I guess a balance. I don't know the specifics, and I really can't speak to all of that. And I guess we could always go back and do a little bit of a deeper dive into all of that and kind of figure out.
I'm just curious, like, is there an amicable way to do this with China where it's not like fucking
Of course there is, but if our country is feeling that it's unjust and there's not a balance with China specifically, then this is the tack they're going to take. But if you take a look at countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, or even Bangladesh and Vietnam. Vietnam is a tiny, tiny country, right? There's no way that there could be a balance, right? It's not going to be equal. just by the sheer size of their population, and quite honestly, what they can manufacture there.
Wait. When you're talking about Japan and China, or Japan, or Vietnam and China?
I'm talking about Vietnam and the U.S.
Okay, yeah, right.
So I think when you look at it, and I think they're probably negotiating these deals, when you look at each individual country, and you say, okay, well, the U.S. is taking in this much, you should be taking in this much. The consumption there is far less than it is here. You know, we have over 350 million people. I don't know what the population is of Vietnam. So I think that there probably has to be a more prorated or balanced approach that definitely has a little bit of a shift, and there's an understanding, to this massive percentage that they want. Now, again, those massive percentages of 46%, certain percentages were 35%, 40%.
It was all over the place.
All over the place. Could be, and very likely was a
ruse, like a distraction?
Not a distraction, more of a negotiating tactic. But nevertheless...
Do you see the logic in that?
No, because of the turmoil. You know, sometimes when you look at things and you say, okay, well, you know what, this is a short-term situation that maybe you take 2 steps backwards to go 4 steps forward, right? So there's value in that. But I think in this instance, I think it could have been executed. In fact, I know it could have been executed better. I can't get into the specifics of the economics or what it is, or the balance or the imbalance that goes between a country like Vietnam and ourselves. But I will tell you that in the apparel sector specifically, which I can speak to, we don't have the resources or the capabilities to provide our consumers with the prices they need, right? $15 an hour is the minimum wage. I have to fairly sure that we're not going to have Americans and U.S. citizens sitting in factories sewing. It's just not happening. Yes, they can manufacture certain things here, but apparel and textile are not one of those things that they can do here. And quite honestly, textile and apparel is a staple for the American population, They do that. Food, shelter, clothing, right?
Right. In that order.
Correct. So to impact that and potentially increase those costs for apparel is only going to hurt the American consumer. In the end, they're the ones who are going to get hurt. It creates a scary situation.
Well, I was going to ask you too, like how, like I'm going to go to the supermarket, or I'm going to go to the bodega, and I'm going to get a few things. Like, is it going to impact everything from food to toilet paper to? I mean, is that the way it's going to be, or is it just going to impact like sneakers and like electronics?
It can't. I think they may. So what you're seeing now is, what was it? Steel. Steel they just increased to 50%, if I'm not mistaken, because we have big steel manufacturing here, right? That is, a lot of it in Pittsburgh, and
But are we scaled up at this point? We haven't really been scaled up like that.
I don't know what the infrastructure looks like for that type of manufacturing. I have no idea.
I would say no. We're not even scaled up to make clothes.
Well, it's a different commodity, and I think that steel, that industrial sector like that, when you're talking in plants and you're talking about these, this molten metal, that's very different than apparel.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know what is going to be.
What's the end game? I think there's a lot of anxiety. Like, everyone has like these anxieties, like, oh shit, I better go buy what I got to buy.
Well, consumer confidence is down. If I took to our retail partners that we work with, items that we know are great are not selling at the rate that they were, at the velocity or the rate that we were talking about. They're just not, and they typically would, right? But I think that the American consumer has some trepidations about what's going to be. What are their lives going to be like, right?
Yeah, no, for real. I'm already personally rethinking, like, all right, we got to scale back even Christmas. Let me start thinking about it now. Let's, my kids are older. Let me have a talk. Literally, like, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's going to be like the canary in the coal mine, Christmas. What is consumer confidence really going to be?
Well, yeah,
when they have to spend
I think
money?
so. People are having, it's very interesting because, you have 6 months, 7 months now before Christmas, and I think that people will have a chance who are concerned to really think about how they want to proceed. You will see a shift.
Yeah, and it may. I also think too, it may not be a horrible thing for the American people to shift in that way, especially with things changing so much that we're such a country that consumes so much. A lot of it's unnecessary. So like
our consumption is through the roof.
Through the roof, and I don't know if it's the levels of consumption that we have versus we're manufacturing outside of the country, but quality has also dropped, and all kinds of things, and a lot of things.
Well, quality drops as prices increase, and to maintain the retail price points, these are not elastic commodities, right? So in order to maintain the prices, there's two things that happen. One is from the manufacturers overseas, if you're able to provide what they call economies of scale and increase the units, so then the cost comes down, and if the efficiencies are high on manufacturing,
right,
you can maintain your costs, right? But as the sales start to slow and units decrease, prices will go up. They just will. I don't know. I don't know what the plan is. I don't know how it's going to shake out. But
let me ask you another question. Like, again, I'm going to go back to this because this is like a glaring thing in my head, is that all these events coincided with these landmark tariffs in American history that I mentioned in the beginning. Is there something that's happening? Was it the pandemic? Is it China's rise?
No.
Is it like what?
Here's what I think. I think that the current administration made a promise to make America great again, and how do you do that? They've taken a broad stroke, right? And they are going back to some of the ways that were done when America, in their minds, was great. Turn of the century, Industrial Revolution. Those were amazing times for the country, right? So, but I think, and I'm not an economist, but I believe that those were those times because of the
it was a newness. It was the first time
in the country. I don't think you can apply that to the current market conditions and the consumer that exists.
Before we get into that, look, I want to know how it's going to affect me. Now, when I go to the bodega, I go get a Dutch, right? I'm going to get a Dutch. I'm going to get a chopped cheese, right? And I'm going to get like un libre de pan y un latita de guava. How much is that going to cost me?
$1.75, I think. I'm not sure. I don't know. No. So here it is. All joking aside. For those foods and for those things that you go into the bodega, you're going to see very little change in your price. Where you're going to really feel the price are on not consumables, but textile, apparel, electronics, car parts, things of that nature. I don't think that when you go in to get a hamburger from your favorite little shop, prices are going to change that significantly. But where the consumer is really going to feel it is at the retail level for apparel, their cars, to repair their cars, all that stuff. So that's where they're going to feel it. But I mean, I get what you're saying. There will be an impact. Don't make any mistake about it. When tariffs increase, the retailer has to raise their price. They have a responsibility to their shareholders, if they're a public company, to have certain profit levels, right? And they have to raise their prices, right? To ensure that they're getting the margin in, the money's going into the cash register, and they have to do that. There's no way around it. Now, what you will see, and we can talk about it later in the program, is that some of these retailers are not passing the costs on to their guests that come to shop. What they're doing is to reduce their overhead, right? They're letting people go. Everybody pays the price. There's nothing good about tariffs. We are not going to revert back to the turn of the century or back to whoever it was after the Revolutionary War where nobody's going to pay taxes. It is not happening. And if it does happen, what will happen is whatever taxes the consumer is saving, they will be paying in the cost of goods. There's no magic bullet here.
Do you think this chaos is going to last? Is there going to be like a final landing spot?
I don't have a crystal ball. We have to see. If the current administration is just doing this to negotiate, possibly. But I have no idea. We've never seen anything like this before. You know, I think that if it was more measured and we talked about it and there was more of a strategic plan rather than coming in and slashing and burning like the Doge did, yes, let's have fiscal responsibility, but let's do it smart. Let's not go in and reduce all the services and take away without knowing the repercussions that are going to happen to the general population.
So let's say you're going to the supermarket, right? Oh no, let's say you're going to the mall, right? You just got out of your nice car, you're going to the mall, and you're going to get, you know, your matcha latte, and maybe picking up some Cialis. Like, is that going to cost you more money?
Cialis? How old do you think I am? What is with you?
Sorry.
What's wrong with you?
I'm sorry.
You couldn't give another analogy?
I couldn't think of anything. That was all I could think.
Okay, well, no. When I go into the supermarket or when I go in there, yes, those again, food is not going to go up. But could my T-shirt go up? Could my socks? Could my underwear? Yeah, those potentially can go up. We're not going to see the real effect until 2026.
All right, on that note, I'd like to thank my captain of industry, Benito, El Jefe Lindo.
I am not a captain of industry. I know a little bit to get into trouble. Or just enough.
Thank you for listening to 6 Train Therapy. See you soon.
See you next time.
Thank you, sir. You're great, by the way.